Good afternoon. Our next speaker, Thomas Reed, has for 2 decades been collecting evidence with regard to a generational abduction case involving his family. This is an encounter of the 4th kind, and it remains one of the strongest cases ever professionally investigated. This is a well-respected family in Connecticut, and Tom will be talking about the evidence in his family's case, the fact it was brought before the United Nations, and he will address the question, UFO, friend or foe. Let me welcome to the stage Mr. Thomas Reed.
Appreciate it. Well done. Can everybody hear me okay? No. Is this any better? All right. They say a picture says 1,000 words, and with that I have about 67 slides. So we have an awful lot to get through in 45 minutes, so I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. What I think is important, that our case is very, very involved. It's very well organized, investigated, documented, and with that I tend to focus a little bit on the documentation first and maybe slip a little bit on what actually took place because it's so much to talk about. So I'm going to give you a little synopsis first, and then we'll get into the documents, and then we'll kind of circle back around. In 1966, my family had a horse farm in Sheffield, Massachusetts. There was about 80 acres. We had a couple of different accounts, 66, 67, and 69 actually, that although it involved our family, there were a lot of locals, there were a lot of mockery, if you will, in school. My parents owned a restaurant, so there was a lot of talk, and a lot of people in the area also knew of this, but we were the family where this actually took place. Several years later, my mother remarried in '72 to Howard Reed, who was an attorney with political aspirations, and it saw that with the help from a friend, Robert Bleckman, who was an attorney, and also in time the public relations director for MUFON, who organized the symposium in 1992 where our case was mentioned. There were a lot of people there. Stanton Friedman was there, but Hopkins and a few others. But with that said, that was pretty much what we thought was the end of it. It was put to bed at that point. And then in 2009, my brother was coming home from a movie, and where there was an orange ball that he saw from his car. He followed it for a while, lost some time, and with that, officials came out, those with backgrounds in law enforcement, the STAR team, MUFON investigated it, along with some private organizations as well, where they found radiation, magnetic fields. There was a lot of trace evidence with that. So that's what fueled our case and how I'm standing in front of you today. So with that, I'd like to move along since we have an awful lot of slides. I want to talk about the official reports. There's polygraphs, radiation, magnetic fields, physical evidence. Again, we'll touch on the 1960s accounts a little bit more in detail, our belief and understanding. To have a clear picture, this is actually my family. Every single one of them has had something to do with this. Marion, my father Howard is no longer with us, my mother Nancy, myself, my brother Matthew, and my son Chance, who's here today. My father, and how this got to the UN, ran for office, and although he lost his first run, he was elected to office with the help and support and backing from Christopher Dodd. And today there's actually a proclamation in the city of Bridgeport that recognizes October 6th as a local recognized holiday for our family. Robert Bleckman, who would eventually take our case to the UN, again, came into the picture later. I have a couple of slides here where you can clearly see these letters are to Robert, and not only what do I find that interesting, I think I want to share that with you, is that on the other slide you'll see where not only was the UN discussing possible sightings, but they got into actual abduction phenomenon. Again, this is kind of the lineup of speakers that took place in the UN symposium, and you can see there some of the speakers, and many of them are still speaking out today. Again, I'm going through some of this early. This is a MUFON journal from 1989, which talks about Robert Blechman, government harassment. Off to the right is an article by MUFON as well that talks about the Reed case and the UN and the connection there. And of course, just some documents that my father handed down to me on top that are dated 4 days after the UN address, and we're going to circle around to that later. It was also investigated by Officer White. Officer White verified the evidence, the radiation, the magnetic fields, and has been supportive to this day. This is some of the notes that he made. The compass would spin in circles when on the roof of the vehicle. The compass was affected when held up to 2 feet away. The second anomaly in evidence was the extremely high amount of radiation. I verified all material and findings in an extraordinary encounter with an unknown powerful force. Debbie Cobble, who many of you may know, the book Intruders was written about her. She was also called in and filmed the anomalies, and she's written some testimony as well. This is the STAR team, if you will, in MUFON CMS, which also points out the radiation and magnetic fields, which I think is very important. An email to us about, again, the anomalies. What happened in '66? My brother and I, what we remember more than anything was the feeling, this vibe. We talk about when there's a full moon, you can stay out longer, you can have that extra drink, you have that energy. You don't know really where it comes from, but you feel it. If you were to triple that to like 3 moons, add in a little anxiety, and then this barometric change in pressure that we felt, almost like being maybe in the middle of a hurricane where it's lighter, but something's wrong, your body senses something's wrong. That's what it was like at first. He was on a top bunk, I was on the bottom bunk, and next we knew we had these silhouettes of figures, if you will, and we were at the top of a staircase. I remember looking down through the stairs, thinking, you know, why aren't we going down the stairs when we just walked across alongside the stairs? We were sandwiched. There was a figure in front of me. There was a figure behind my brother. And it was like the ground just changed beneath our feet, and we were at the corner of our property line. That's the top right corner that you see there, which was probably several hundred yards from our home. There was an engaging, calm feeling that we felt. They moved very slowly. And what I'd like to do, since we are short on time, I think I'm going to actually play an insert from my mother. This is one of the first times she's spoken out in years. Hopefully you'll hear this okay.
And have you had any other experiences beyond that? I mean, I think you had some later on.
Later on, yes. Many years later on, as a matter of fact, when we had our home in Sheffield, Massachusetts, incidents happened again. And actually it started with my sons.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much directly with me, although I had never forgotten that. And when I'm talking to you about it right now, I can feel it exactly as it was in 1954. It was that frightening. But the connection seemed to come with Thomas and Matthew. And we lived on a farm, which is very far out of town. It was another very rural area. And they... whatever it was, I'll call them aliens for lack of another word, actually, they seemed to want to connect with them, my children. It wasn't so much myself, I was there. I remember the incidents very well from my perspective. Thomas and Matthew, of course, were intricately involved in the incidences, so they have the more details than I do. Mine was... for instance, when they were missing, trying to find them when they were missing from the house. that kind of a thing. I'm sure Thomas has talked to you about this anyway. So,
Are you aware that your mother or anyone else in your past family has had any kind of experiences like this?
my mother, not in the past, but she was living with us at the time, in the 60s when we had the farm, when a lot of the incidents happened to Matthew and Thomas, and she also experienced some of, especially when we were riding back in the station wagon, that incident. My mother was there and very much involved with that.
Okay, that was a little lengthy, but I wanted to hear it from her voice rather than me try to relay that for her. This is actually the area that we walked through. Actually, my son and I went back there about last year, and I showed him where this happened. The shot you're seeing with my brother and I in the bottom, we're actually standing on a rock that we ended up seeing later on. When we were taken to this area, we had never been there before. We weren't allowed to ride up there. We were not allowed to be there. It was too far from the home. If we took a horse and fell, my mother couldn't have found us. So this was the very first time that we actually saw this area, and that plays a part in this too. When I walked down that path with my brother in 66, we had passed this rock, and then there was this wishbone tree, which I spent a lot of time with an illustrator putting this together. That is pretty much what we saw. The light underneath it was added in only because we didn't want the picture to be too dark. It was fairly dark that night, but that is what we came upon. We came in on, the craft was actually lower. We were on a hill. We stepped down. The tree, the wishbone tree, if you will, was up on top of this bit of an incline. We walked down. We came in on it at about the 6-inch mark. There was a figure about the 11-inch mark off to the right, and we were brought inside this area that basically was about a 15 by 15 area. My brother was standing in the hallway. If I can move this mouse, maybe. He was here. I was brought in further back. I didn't see him at the time. I was brought by him. It almost appeared as if he was sleeping, standing up. There was a figure next to him, and I was brought up to the front of this darker area. It was very muggy, very, very dark. And at that point, I kept looking back for my brother being I was worried about him. He was a couple years younger than me. But there was also a comfort, I think, that came with knowing he was there. There was a shot that was shown. It was basically a willow image that has been symbolic to our family ever since. This is what I looked at for minutes, I believe. The tree was moving. There was light coming through it. It was captivating to me. We had a black and white television set at the time, so it was very interesting. This is more like an indoctrination, if I had to label it as anything, because I don't remember much more happening than that. A year later, we had an incident that was very, very similar to that. So I don't get too wrapped up in this. I'm going to play an insert from my brother, if that would be all right.
Probably the thing that sticks out the most was there's this energy in the air that always seems to occur flame. My brother actually explained it very well. When there's a full moon and you get that vibe that there's just a little bit of anxiousness in the air. If you were to take that same kind of feeling and multiply it by 3. And so now you have not just the anxiety, but then there's just literally a electricity in the air that you can almost cut with a knife. And there was these flashes of lights, and I thought there was a thunderstorm coming, so I kind of threw this blanket over my head. Flashes would admit, but there was no thunder. And then they got brighter and brighter, and to a point that they were almost completely penetrating the wall. You could almost see the light coming through the wall, not just the window, and things started to rattle. There was a hatch in the bedroom that went into a crawl space over our dining room, and that started rattling, and I thought maybe Tom was kicking in or something, making noise. It didn't make sense because we were very close, and he wouldn't tease me to do it, but in my mind, that's what I thought was happening. And literally, he was just gone. I leaned down, he was gone. I knew that he didn't go out the door because it was an old farm door that had a lift and turn kind of latch to get out, so it took 2 hands, and it made a lot of noise, so I knew he didn't go out the door. Literally, he was gone, and I jumped out and ran into my mom's room. It was at that point that I'd seen beings coming up the stairway into the bedroom. I was trying to wake my mom. They came into the room and were actually surrounding not me or my mother, but was actually surrounding my grandmother, which I think, again, makes this case very unique because of the family history that happened prior to even being born, that my grandmother did speak about later on after this, but they were over her, and I was trying to wake my mom, and she was just completely out of it. And I couldn't wake her. She wouldn't move. She just would not wake up. They then left the room, and my mom was finally, I was able to wake her up, yelling, "Tom's gone." There was things in the house.
Okay, I'm going to cut that just a little short. But what he's referring to is the second episode that we had, or the second, I'm sorry, hello? Can you hear me better now? Keep my head down. What he's referring to is the second night was a little bit different. The second night there was a flash in the room to the point my younger brother had covered his head. He felt that there was light coming in from pretty much everywhere. What I remember from that night was that I was in a conversation with my brother on the top bunk. We couldn't go to bed again. We couldn't go to sleep. It was just that same vibe, that same feeling that you feel. And all of a sudden, it looked like just a camera flash, basically. And I felt as if I was in an ocean wave. If you've ever been caught in like an undertow, I kind of rolled. I kind of felt like I didn't know which way was up. And that was the last I remember, except for being found in the driveway by my mother, which I could actually play for you, but I think I'm running a little behind on time. This was what the craft looked like. I spent a lot of time with an illustrator, and this is about as accurate as I can get it. Some have asked, did it have windows? Well, I didn't see them, so I'm not going to just assume to put those in, but that's what it looked like. It looked like a rounded turtle shell is what it looked like, tarnished. It wasn't that polished silver. That's what we saw. We first thought it was a big pile of dirt because it's dark out. Again, that was the layout, and and this is a collective effort between my brother and I from two different accounts. What really did it for our family was 1969. I was in a horse show. My saddle came loose. I was taking home on a different route, and I'd gotten a brown ribbon. I was pretty upset about it. So my family took me out, or my mother, I should say my grandmother, took me out for a bite to eat and an ice cream like most parents would do. We were in the tri-state area up near the Connecticut, New York, Mass line. When I was giving my brother a fireball, actually. My grandmother turned around from the passenger seat and had looked over the back of the car and had seen lights coming in. With that, she tried to make sense of what this was, and while we were driving, it was a flicker almost from the trees and the lights in the woods, but I guess not being a novice to it, she kind of had an assumption. And we went a mile or so down the road a little further, and from what my mother and grandmother have told me, that the car just pretty much came to a stop. It just rolled off the side of the road. You could hear the stones clanking on the bottom of the car, and it was just dead silent. Everything went silent. Then there was, and we all remember this just eruption of crickets, but it was loud. It was just went from dead silent to an eruption, and then we were in this holding area. That's how fast it was. That's all we remember. I wish I could tell you more about what happened. I was walked out. This figure came in about 5 feet or so, and I walked up to it. The earlier accounts seemed to be more of an indoctrination, softer. This was a little more barbaric, if you will, or should say fast-paced. It was harsh. I was taken out this door. These walls here were extremely high. It came to a sharp T. I took a left, and I was held or escorted along by my left arm. There was a force on my left arm, and I was taken into this room. When I came into this room, there were these figures that were extremely disturbing. There were two at the bottom of this table that I was to sit on at the time, not lay on, but sit on. So I slid up on it. It was actually very low. I do remember that. Tables were like bronze, too. I remember that. And this is, again, an illustration that is really the best way that I can get this across to you on what it was like. As you see, I'm sitting there. Before that happened, I was actually upright. And I had this creature here had turned its head. These are pretty much to scale, but they were basically off to the right. I had jumped off and gone out this opening, which was very bright. I had come into a large, open, intersecting hallway that looked like a Y. Huge, very wide hallways, 3 intersecting. There were 2 off to this side that were very close together. The third one was further away. So I came off center. And I didn't know where to go. It was like I ran into an auditorium. And I was taken, I was grabbed, and I was put on this table, as you see before you. There were holes in the side of it, and this thing had lowered over me. It was like a cage. I felt it was to keep me from running. And there were these pieces that were actually put through the side of it, which that actual top picture is just a raisin. But I referenced them as rocks when I was a child because there were something placed on my leg and my side and my face. And to be quite honest with you, that is really the last thing I remember, except being brought back into this holding area and then being brought back to the car with my family. My mother and brother and grandmother all remember something somewhat similar. My grandmother, when we came back, was found walking in the middle of the road. My mother was in the passenger seat. My brother was out, his head was on my knee, like in a fetal position. I opened up my door. My grandmother was maybe 15 to 20 feet in front of the car. She was the only one conscious. I got out, I started to walk towards her. She was in disarray. She was drifting from side to side, kind of walking aimlessly. I'm sorry, this isn't easy for me. I had caught up to her when she got into this store. She walked in the front door, walked by the clerk. I came in right behind her, and she walked to the back of the store, circled around these bikes and carts and baskets, if you will, and strollers. And I kept trying to say, Nana, let's go. And she wouldn't take my hand. And then she put her hands on a stroller, like you see there, and she started to push it back and forth as if there was a child in it. The only thing I can make of it. Finally, she took my hand, came around the back side, and I took her out to the car. And my mother was conscious at that point, and we drove home. This is what I sketched when I was 9 years old, on top left. The other is an illustration, obviously, that was done by Cliff Springfield, who has spent a lot of time on it with my family. And it's as accurate as we can be. We don't remember the feet. That was just put in there, but everything else is pretty much what we remember. We're not sure if it had 2 arms or 3 arms, but the illustration that I made when I was a child looked like it was hairier, but that's the best that we can come up with without over-speculating or going too far with it. We don't think it's anything more than just a large spider. Later on, our family was pretty shook up. My bedroom was moved. I was moved into my mother's room. My mother came in to give me a kiss goodnight. Since my mother was actually divorced at the time, she used to come in all the time, twice, to say goodnight to us. And the second time I was half asleep, I guess, and she came over to give me a kiss goodnight. I saw her head come towards me, and I had taken a fork. I used to sleep with a fork, and I had actually caught her in the forehead with a fork, to give you an idea of how this was for me. What was interesting about that, too, is this was years later. My mother had since planted a willow tree at a watering hole for her horses, and I could see it out my window, so sometimes I think that maybe that triggered something. Not sure why I did that, but the sketch that I drew on the bottom left actually hung in this classroom. This was a sketch that I saw in '66 as I tried to reproduce what I saw in the craft. And the reason I did that, my first day of 4th grade, I had gone into school. The teacher asked me to take my seat, and I looked on the wall, and there were all these sketches from children from the year before. This is the first day. And they were green men from Mars and different spaceships and so on. And I said to the teacher, they're not green and they're not from Mars. And she asked me how I knew that. And Of course, she didn't believe a word of it, but anyway, that's where that sketch hung, which is in Roswell today. I get these sent to me, since we're on this topic of that sketch, sent to me from people. This was from a woman in Portland who drew this when she was in school. This is another shot from actually the Officer White's front yard, oddly enough. One of the things that Robert Bleckman did in the early years was he investigated sightings and those cases that were validated or had value or were considered to be somewhat serious. This was 7 miles from her home in August of 1969. This was another one 35 minutes from her home. This is also a CE3. And again, there was an awful lot of talk in our neighborhood. There were people that came into my mother's store who would whisper things and mention that something had happened to their family. And of course, the ongoing fights, if you will, in school that I had. I'm going to play something from about 1954 from my mother.
Hi, Nancy. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm very, very good. Thank you so much for being willing to come on and talk a little bit about your experiences.
Okay.
What I'd really like to do is talk about the 1954 experience that you had. And do you think you could just start off by describing what happened?
Yes, we were in Maine, taking my brother up to the University of Maine, and we had stopped over at Moosehead Lake, which is pretty far up in Maine. It's a pretty rural area, very rural Maine. And actually, it was a normal day up until we went to bed, and I was awakened sometime in the early morning hours. Strangely enough, I was awakened by a presence that was in the room with me, and I felt that my bed was surrounded by something. And I actually found myself very frightened and found it impossible to speak out loud. I couldn't call to my mother or anyone else in the house, or the cabin, I should say. And I couldn't move. And I felt like I was being observed by a number of creatures, if you want to call it that, or people or whatever. It was I've never been that frightened in my life. I've never been unable to move or communicate with somebody. I could barely move my hands or my feet. I was just frozen. And this went on for a long time. It was daybreak before I can remember suddenly finding myself released and able to move.
And so did you perceive yourself ever leaving the room, or do you think you stayed in the bed?
No, I think I was being observed. I don't think I ever physically left the room.
Okay.
I think I was being observed for some unknown reason, and it was a very, very frightening feeling. 1954, just jumping back, because I forgot to mention something to you, my girlfriend had ridden up to Maine with us also, and she had a similar experience the same night that I did, so I was not the only one.
Oh, really?
Cabin that experienced that. That was not just me.
What's interesting about that is this, that around that same week, there was a count that Robert brought to our attention. That was also the James Howard flight, which was in Gooseneck Lake, I guess, right over the Canadian border. And this is the kind of work that Robert started to do. Now I'm going to get into what happened and how we got to the UN. This, again, is part of that Robert Bleckman's work that he did. This is actually, again, taken from that James Robert flight from New York to London. This is actually a shot, apparently, of the craft that was where they dispatched an F-94 fighter jet to it. And again, this is only about 50 miles from where my mother and grandmother were that same week. Over time, we've been able to spot some abilities in our children. I'm going to move along quickly here, but this is a composite score. This is actually from my son, who's here. Where he fell into the 127th percentile. He beat an unbeaten chess pro in 4th grade. These are things that we were not really looking for, but just happened to look back on now and say, you know, could this possibly be something more than what it appears to be? This is a shot of my son, obviously, sitting and walking a tiger. I don't know how many of you have children that do that, but I found it to be a little different. And again, this is, again, some of his records showing way in the superior range. He was tested at the Miami Children's Hospital, and he was tested in Knoxville, and where he was found to have some heightened abilities. Now, we moved to 2009, which is how this whole case got fueled. An orange ball was seen by my brother as he came out of a movie theater. Now, this is 40 years later. He was with a friend. He found himself shortly after in a field in Brownsburg. There were YouTube videos shot of this thing. Different teams came out. Again, MUFON, independent aerospace groups. Again, there was some law enforcement. And doctors looked at my brother to find that he had puncture wounds over a gland that produces the body's immune system. He also had 2 more behind his right ear. Debbie Cobble, who the book Intruders was written about by Bud Hopkins, had come out with a camera. This is what she had to say, that she witnessed the compass spinning. Again, we're kind of circling around right now to show you why I mentioned that in the beginning. And I want to show you the compass. This was actually filmed by Debbie Cobble in 2009. These are how strong the magnetic fields were around our vehicle.
Oops. When I get near the end, it starts to spin. There it goes. I'm down at the end of the vehicle.
Now, why I think that's important is that if you look into or look at the studies that have been about the electromagnetic fields and the pulses around the brain, you can actually cause hypnotic state by these tuned ELF, these low frequency ELF. Hypnotic state is 10 hertz. So what happened with my brother and what happened with us in the 60s, we think was nothing more, this vibe that we felt was nothing more than something generated, a type of or a form of or a tuned ELF. I could be wrong, it's just a theory that we have. In Indianapolis, how this also became was there was actually a little something on Fox News.
Alien encounter case drawing national attention. Thomas and Matt Reed say as young boys, they were taken from their home by odd-looking creatures. Matt now lives in Brownsburg and says he had another encounter in 2009. They're both here this morning to share their story. And I want to start with, I know there are a lot of people watching, they're going to say, what are you guys talking about? This is crazy. I know that you guys take it very seriously and you're offended when people say, don't take you seriously, right?
Well, I don't know if it's really that. I just think that you have to look at the facts, and the facts speak for themselves. I mean, there was radiation, there were magnetic fields. It was discussed at the United Nations in 1992. It's a credible family. My father was in politics. Senator Dodd was a backer of my father. This happened back in the 1960s.
The first time?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was kind of historic in some respects, but it was kept quiet. And then in 2009, when Matthew was involved with this case here, it kind of fueled everything.
Yeah.
And it was taken very, it was handled very professionally.
Let's talk about what did happen, and let's start with 2009.
Right.
What happened and describe to us. And I know we have some photos and some pictures of things.
Right. In 2009, it was a typical evening, and a friend and I, we came back from a movie, and essentially saw this orange ball of light, started to follow it. My vehicle completely shut down. There was almost $2,000 worth of damage to the vehicle, the electrical system. I have an hour and 32 minutes of missing time. I do have flashes of what occurred then. But when I contacted my brother, because he's been documenting this for nearly 30 years, a team of professional investigators from a privately funded aerospace company came out, and they documented the fact they found trace radiation on my vehicle, strange magnetic anomalies to my vehicle. All of a sudden we have some professionals that are now investigating the case, and they went back through our family history with a fresh set of eyes. One of the officers has over 30 years of crime scene investigation experience and reevaluated everything that occurred, and then we could suddenly see patterns that have occurred since the 60s.
It's pretty interesting discovery.
Okay, I'm being told I gotta move it away. Wow. Not me. Okay, I'm gonna try to wrap this up as quick as I can. I wanted you to hear a little bit from my family, not just me, and I wanted you to see a little bit more than just a story or hear more than just a story. I wanted you to see that there are a lot of documents, and there's a lot of value, and there are a lot of cases that have an awful lot to offer. And with that said, I think that, and hopefully that this case will be looked at in that light, and we'll be able to continue the work that we're doing to bring more evidence forward and more documents. This is something that you might, again, we're working on now to try to make sense of. I can't really say for sure what happened here, but I just want to share this with you. My father and Robert Bleckman were going to write a book. This was in 2006. When Robert Bleckman, I showed you those earlier papers that came back that he had from the UN or whatever, and his personal papers that he had. My father went to work, was found very sick in his office, was rushed to the emergency room. The CDC actually was called in. The department said that they weren't sure if this building that he was working at, he was now a principal at a school, he stepped down from politics, was where they found this virus, and apparently it was. It's been shut down. The school has been closed and condemned since the day my father died. There's now a bench in his honor that sits in Bridgeport, Milford actually. Robert Bleckman, who took our case to the UN, passed shortly later, June 18th, 2008. Again, these are some of the papers that were brought back that my father turned over to me. Whether it has anything to do with it, I can't say. I just want to share this with you. This is a doctor that evaluated our son, evaluated the marks on my brother's chest. This date, if you look to the top left, September 15th, 2010. He was found dead 8 weeks later on November 12th, 2010. Leave it up to you. They say a scoop mark has something to do with it. We have them. This is the one I have on my arm, whether it does or not. This is my polygraph test. I took a polygraph just recently in August, after this all happened, in August of 2010, which I passed with no deception. Something that does seem to be of interest to people is the Rh negative factor. Whether, again, it is or it isn't, I'm just letting you see this for yourself. 9 of us in our family are Rh negative. That's probably a little different. These are a couple more illustrations I did as a child, and what I feel about the Rh negative factor. I'm going to play something for you. Sorry about all the embedded information, but I know I only had 45 minutes today, and I'm trying to get through it as quick as I can.
If all of mankind evolved from a common ancestor, why isn't everyone's blood compatible with one another? Where did the Rh negative come from? As many of you are aware, embolic disease is the allergic reaction that occurs when an Rh negative mother is carrying an Rh positive child. Her body builds up antibodies to actually destroy the alien substance, the same way it would a virus, thereby terminating the infant. Why would a mother's body reject her own offspring? Nowhere else in nature does this occur naturally. This problem does occur in mules, the cross between a horse and a donkey. The fact alone points to the distinct possibility of a cross-breeding between two similar but genetically different species. No one can explain where the Rh negative comes from. I, as well as most familiar with blood factors, admit that these people must at least have a mutation, if not being descendants of a different ancestor altogether.
Quick insert from my mother on her feeling about this.
So how do you feel looking back? I don't talk about it much, and I don't even like to talk about it, to be perfectly honest with you. But I've always felt that the experiences were mostly something from another aliens that were actually trying to communicate with us and learn something about us. It's frightening because of the way these experiences came about. But in actuality, I don't think it was meant for harm. I think it was more like a biological thing, or they wanted to see how we operated here, or observing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Changing my belief, because I believe that we're all part of a creation. I think we're all part of a larger world. So the fact that I'm frightened was probably strangeness. They didn't hurt me physically. But I certainly knew that they were in control of me, and as I understand it from Thomas and Matthew, their experience is related to sort of the same thing. So they wanted to find out something, I think, actually, and maybe they did. It's odd that it follows our family. That's a very strange thing. But it has, and it's been going on and off since 1954, which is a lengthy time. It's I'm an old very old lady, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. So.
Okay, I think I obviously have to wrap this up, but with what I've shared with you, our feeling is that man was originally Rh negative, and that perhaps that's why, in our family anyway, there's a genetic need for something, that there's maybe an extraction, hormones, something being taken from us that maybe is needed somewhere else. Maybe we were a failed experiment. Maybe our senses didn't develop like they should have. Like, a shark can smell blood for miles away. Maybe there was something that we were supposed to be able to, this unbelievable brain that we have, are we really using it? No, we're not. Why aren't we? Maybe there's something that just did not take off the way it should have. And maybe it was something that, again, we brought out. In closing, under the heading of friend or foe, this is actually, in short, how our family feels about everything.
Natural disasters such as the Ice Age and asteroid strikes can cause the extinction of life on a planet and act in a similar manner to the reformatting of a hard drive on a computer, wiping out the old data to store the new in its place. These reformats of life on the planet allowed it to become a breeding ground for the millions of creatures that live here today. The species that live here now are radically different from the creatures that lived here before. For example, a modern bird is on average 8 inches from head to tail, and we accept that as normal. Air creatures before were typically over 20 feet long and had 36-foot wingspans. I find it interesting that a planet that has experienced multiple extinctions due to planetary disasters now seems very well organized, populated, and reassembled with an estimated 25 to 100 million diverse species existing today. I personally believe that mankind is part of this repopulation and that we are the product of previous gene manipulation and DNA splicing by these extraterrestrial entities to manufacture a new species with a specific biological quality common to both us and them. I believe we are distantly related in that they are harvesting particular biological products such as hormones or antibodies from specific biotypes to create a purified hybrid species somewhere else.
If I have time for questions, anybody? I got 3 minutes? Very short questions. Okay. Anybody? Was that clear? This is just how I feel about it. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry?
Is this the first time you've actually thought it false?
It's the first time I've used embedded audio.
Can you repeat the question so everybody can hear? Repeat what he said so everybody can hear.
Is this my first time in a conference such as this? It's the first time I've embedded audio clips for my family. Over the past couple of years, I've really tried to speak for them. And in a lot of ways, it makes it very difficult because then I tend to, how could I know that? How could I know this? How could I know that? When in fact, it was actually relayed to us. We've got folders and binders that we've been keeping ever since the 60s. And so now that the rest of my family is in some way going out and speaking on their own, I've tried to use their words now rather than muddy it, if you will, with me trying to make sense out of what they feel. I hope that answers your question.
Early in your presentation, you showed a diagram of the disc, and above that were some symbols. Where were those?
Yes, the symbols that when I was younger, I had actually I had gone to an abduction group meeting in Fort Myers, Florida, run by Tim Wilson, who actually is also friends with Debbie Cobble, and they were working on a book, and I was asked to turn these symbols in that I had seen back in 1966 that I had kept for all these years, and they were like F's with dots and C's with slashes, and it's what I remembered, it's what I wrote down, and I had turned them over to Tim Wilson, who had forwarded them to Bud Hopkins back in 1994.
So the symbols were on the disc?
The symbols were on a table, actually. When I was in the hallway, the room was large, it was black, there was one table over here, there was one in front of me. They were, one was at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock pretty much. They looked somewhat identical. They're very low. I could see underneath them, I believe that they were like an L, if you will. And on top, it looked bronze, and there were etchings. And I had scribbled them down, and if anything, it would resemble maybe Braille in some respects. And I just wrote down what I felt I saw, and I've kept them ever since I was a child. And thank you. That's it? Okay. I hope I was able to add a little bit more than just a story and able to offer a little bit of tangibles and documentation and proof. And I want to thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I never liked going. Just walk out? Yeah.